Alright, hello everyone. This is just something I've been working on the past few days. Something different to work on besides Ruby Remnants, and I thought might as well record a bit of my thoughts on it so that get the word out there and just tell you all what other stuff I've been working on. So if it's your first time here, my name is Saito-kun. I'm an artist, but I do a lot of fan projects, namely one for Ruby. Right now, that's the big one. But I also design games as a hobby, that is. But namely tabletop RPGs. I used to play a good deal of Dungeons and Dragons a year or two back, and that sort of got me hooked since then. And basically, I dabble a lot in designing my own system. A system I've been working on for the past 2 years, I guess, called Voyager. And this one is entirely my own setting with its own characters, stuff like that. It's not connected to the D&D OGL or SRD or anything like that. It's its own fresh system. But what recording this today is to show off a conversion of it. So basically, I've made the system as its original thing, but also the idea is that I want to be able to easily homebrew or make custom settings or conversions of it into other franchises. So it's it'll be easy for me to do that. And one of those things that I'm doing right now is for Genshin Impact. Basically taking the entirety of the experience of, at least my experience of Genshin's gameplay, what I like about it, and converting it into a tabletop setting that I can customize, which is called Genshin Tactics. But how this came about is there was a person who came to my server, the Voyager server, whose name was username, and they asked about the system. They were looking around on the internet, wondering if there was indeed a Genshin style tabletop that they could look for and play with their group, and somehow or other they found out about my system, which I sort of posted about in an obscure forum post a few months back, and that led them to here, and that motivated me to well, okay, if I know someone's gonna play this, then that's an excuse for me to go back and work on this thing that's been in my to-do list for a while now. And this is something that I've been planning to do for Ruby as well, which is to take all of Ruby's stuff like semblances and dust and aura and convert that into my system as well. So that's another chapter in part of my plans, at least for the tabletop design scene. Now, I've been doing this so far on Scribus, which is a desktop publishing software. Entire PDF for this is almost finished. I would say 75 to 80% finished already, actually. And it's about 96 pages long. I find that the rules are not too heavy. The entirety of the rule set in this entire game is about 32 pages long. I think quite reasonable. And it covers things from weapon types, roles, how to cast magic, elemental reactions, stuff like that, all sort of based on that original Voyager system that I made, but simplified and refined further for this. So I kind of learned a lot about my own custom system while making this, and I hope to refine further, especially if there's people who would willing to play test it, which is partly why I'm making this video as well, to help sort of promote it, so that if anyone is interested in that sort of thing, especially given the recent news about the OGL. I mean, clearly this is a very different thing from D&D, but I guess this is the time where people are looking for different systems. And while the overlap of Genshin Impact players and tabletop players is maybe about 50 people, I hope those 50 people will find this video and maybe find something that they will enjoy. So the rest of the document is basically just a bunch of characters. So obviously, being a tabletop, you can make your own characters, and so far in the PDF I have included sort of short guide of how to make one using these rules. But namely, given that I expect that a lot of people playing it or who are interested in playing it would obviously, they will know the Genshin cast, and they'll probably want to, number one, replicate that character or even play that character itself. And number two, just sort of to give an example of how a Genshin style character would work in the system. I've made a bunch of preset characters that have their own abilities and all that, but it's basically converting their in-game abilities into this system. So even stuff like their basic attack, their elemental skill, their elemental burst, and then which is are like their starting abilities, and then going into like all the stuff that as you level you can get, like, you know, their ascension abilities and like their constellations, instead of like gacha thing where you have to get multiple copies of someone to unlock their constellation. Here it's just like, it's more like a typical skill tree in a game where as you complete quests you get a set number of XP, and you can spend that XP every session to unlock constellations or other things. It's like gacha but without any of the salt, which I think all of us would be happier with. So there were about, I forget how many, but I think at least 10 to 12 or 13 preset characters already, which I hope run the gamut of like enough variation of like weapons and elements and playstyles to go from, such as like main DPS types like Keqing and Hu Tao, to more like, you know, summon type characters like Fischl, Mona. You know, I'm biased towards the actual characters I like in game, but I think there's a good mix of them here, and hopefully if enough people are interested in it, I could convert more of the characters, or even like eventually all of them, I guess, into the system. But yeah, I can start going into like the actual rules themselves and sort of give you an idea of how it plays. Okay, so let's go through a quick rundown of how to play, basically. So what we have is, it's based on tiles, so very similar to D&D. So whether you want to call them tiles or like 5 feet per tile, you know, depends on your immersion, but for the sake of simplicity, everything is called tiles. And it follows a action point system. So I'll just use 5th edition as like a comparison point, since that's probably what most people are familiar with. But in 5th edition you have like a minor action, a main action or major action or whatever it was called, and then that's your turn, and then the movement's a separate thing. But here, this is more along the lines of like a Pathfinder style action system, where you have 3 action points which you can freely spend to move, attack, or cast, or use abilities. And everything that you do is within those 3 action points. So you can use 1 AP to sort of move, so that's 2 tiles in like diagonally or straight, to climb, and basically all sorts of movement. You can use it to attack, which is 1 AP. You can choose to guard, which is basically like a Persona 4 style guard, where you decrease any damage dealt to you but you hold your turn, which will be quite important later as we touch on like initiative. And then there's instant dodge. Instant dodge is like you spend 1 AP to dodge and attack immediately. In like video game terms, it gives you iframes and you are immune to that attack. But of course you lose AP, which means that you will have less options for your turn later on. And going to like initiative, I was testing around a lot of different initiative systems, but eventually, at least for the sake of this play's test, I just wanted to go with something quite simple. All players roll a d20, and then whoever gets like a lower number, like 1 or 2, they'll go earlier. And then the GM or the Game Master, they roll the same d20 but for all their enemies, because I expect there to be like quite a lot of enemies in this system. So they roll once, but then enemies have like a speed stat that will determine how early they go. So if the player rolls a 5, then the 5 determines that, okay, they'll go quite early. If the GM rolls a 6 for the enemies, so by default the enemies will go later, but then individual enemies that are faster will have like a speed stat of say like +1 or +2, or in this case -1 or -2. That will make them have an initiative of 3 or 4 instead, so they'll go earlier. And that's just, it's a very quick and dirty system, but I think for the purposes of playtesting it should be just fine. So everything that you can do is just like whether you move and attack, that's all within your turn. That's pretty straightforward. But if you choose to cast an ability, so if you choose to use an elemental burst, if you choose to cast magic, basically anything that's a bit more powerful that uses magic, you enter a casting state, which means your turn will be delayed until it finishes casting. So if you were going before someone, but you choose to cast, then you will delay your turn by whatever the amount is. The more powerful it is, the longer it takes to cast. When you finish casting, you can move again and conclude your turn. And of course the ability goes off. Which means that during this time, you'll be defenseless and you will need your teammates to sort of cover for you while you cast. Or, you know, just hope that you're lucky. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff too, but there will be a PDF, obviously. It's not done yet, but if you go to my server, which is the Voyager server, which is in the description, you'll be able to find the in-progress document for it, which is essentially already playable at this state. And I think maybe by the time I post this, it might be mostly complete, but we'll see. Another aspect of this is weapon archetypes and roles. So since it's a tile-based system, I will add, I should have said this earlier, but I'm going unscripted here, is that it's sort of based more on like tactics style games. So think of like Fire Emblem or like Archetypes, basically, where each person has like a set tile range, and that's sort of how you have to maneuver your units. Because the original system I made this for, Voyager Tactics, is closer to that sort of Fire Emblem type gameplay feel. So for Genshin, I also applied that. Maybe it would benefit more, like a true Genshin style tabletop will probably benefit more from like Theater of the Mind style game, but for this purpose, I think it still works, and I think it still can be fun. And each weapon archetype that each character has its own set range and attack area. Another aspect of this, which is I guess unique to this system, is a critical trait. So there are no classes per se in this game, but you do have a role, and that role determines your critical trait. So what is a critical trait? It's basically when you're in combat, you have certain things that you can do that's different depending on the role. So if you are one of these roles, which is a Valiant, you want to back up your teammates, there are certain criteria that you need to fulfill before you can activate a critical attack. So in the case of a Valiant, you need to be attacking an enemy that is also being flanked or targeted by an ally. And if that happens, your next attack will be a critical. But a critical isn't always just double damage in this instant. It depends on your role. So because the Valiant is more of like a support type role, what happens when you get a critical attack is you can choose an ally to move one tile in any direction for free. So this can be done outside of their turn, and basically gives them free movement. And this is sort of like something that gives critical attacks a role other than just pure damage. But there is, of course, a pure damage role, which is called the Striker, whose critical attack does hit twice, which basically means they're the DPS, designated DPS role. And then there's another one called the Watcher, whose criteria for landing a critical hit is taken inspiration from, I believe, I forgot what the game was called. I think it was called Wargroove. Basically, that game had like different sort of critical traits based on the class or the role of that unit. And one of them was the Archer, who, to get a critical attack, have to be not moving before the attack, which is the same for the Watcher here. They will have to have not moved at the start of that turn when they're making an attack. So if you move that attack, then you do not get a benefit. But if you do, then you would activate your critical attack, and the next ally on the initiative order after you will start the turn with 1 extra AP. So this is like another support-ish type class that can give your team more actions in battle. And then another one is sort of like the tank, aggro tank role, which is the Vanguard, which is if they are surrounded by more than one enemy, then it activates a critical attack, and the next critical attack will stagger the enemy, which is a status effect, which will cause that enemy's turn to be delayed by 1 turn, which means they will go later, which could help your allies to attack first. So that's one unique aspect of this system. And then we get into the casting. And the casting is another beast all in itself, but basically whenever you land a critical attack, you will have to roll a dice, which is a d20 dice, a 20-sided die. And what you roll from that determines basically how much magical energy you get. So I guess in the Genshin terms, it's like, what's it called, the Favonius? It was either the Sacrificial Sword or the Favonius Sword or something like that, that it'll be on screen, where critical attacks give you energy, but this is like a core mechanic itself, where if you land a critical attack using your given roll trait, then you get a set amount of energy based on the number you roll on the dice, and then you can spend that energy to use on abilities, which, you know, we'll go into more detail in the actual PDF. And then that's basically the gist of it, and the rest is all like, you know, status, conditions, ailments, and of course elemental reactions, where each character has abilities that they can use, and you know, if the person after you uses another element, then of course it creates another effect. which is of course part of the core enjoyment aspect of Genshin, one of its identifying fun factors, which I wanted to replicate here as well. So it has everything here from like swirl to melt, vaporize, burn, crystallize, which will create shields for everyone, all that sort of stuff, which has been vastly simplified because, you know, a computer is not doing the calculation for you. So I wanted to make something that was easy for people to calculate by themselves. And so far, it's quite straightforward. There are no artifacts or different weapons, stuff like that. Everyone is just assumed to be using their own signature weapon with no like added traits or whatever, because I know artifact sets so far, because I felt like this system alone with the tile positioning and chaining attacks together and casting is already, I think, complex enough that there's no need to really like add more when that's not needed. Right, so it's things like stats and all that, because this doesn't have like the traditional D&D style stats of like constitution, wisdom, dexterity, strength, stuff like that. It's just whatever your ability's damage number is, that's how much damage it does. And it's all based on your positioning and synergizing with your teammates. That's sort of the core, one of the core tenets of this custom system that I've made. Because like I've had games where I have like 12 spells and I'm trying to figure out like what each of them do, how much damage do they do, what's the saving throw for it, and it just becomes like a really big chore to sort of keep track of all them. So what I want to do is make something that's a lot simpler, in the sense there's less bookkeeping, but more complex in that there's a lot more potential for character builds and strategy, basically, which, you know, I hope comes across. And then of course the skills. This skill list is also quite simplified. It's been refined over quite a long time, but it's basically 11 skills that determine everything that you can do within the game, which I use the same one for Genshin Tactics as well as Voyager Tactics. How you can make it more specific to your particular character is through specialties. So your specialty is basically doing character creation. You just choose about 3 specialties, which are just things that you're good at, right? Let's say under the category of operate, basically like your practical ability to operate tools and things like that, you can choose your specialty to be, you can play the guitar, or you can make traps, or can make machines, or you're a good cook. So basically anything that you can picture your character being good at that fits one of these categories, that is your specialty. And then during your playing the game, you just use that specialty doing any skill checks, which of course will be like a certain role and all that. But basically, instead of like a target number that you try to go for, the GM doesn't determine the difficulty number. Rather, your role determines the outcome of the skill check, which is, you know, the lower number is worse and the higher number is better, which is quite straightforward. But then by having a specialty and training that specialty, upgrading it, you can then roll an additional die to add to that skill check, which will help bolster the outcome of that number towards the positive. And then basically so far, I have most of the combat down. As for the only stuff left is a dedicated section on like exploration and section for like enemies and stuff like that. So like hilichurls, abyss mages, all that kind of stuff. And then finally a more detailed homebrew guide, like how to make your character, how to customize them. I do have like an example of how to make one there. I do have an example here of how to make a character using this system, and it's using one of the Voyager characters, which is Suki. But basically I've taken her. I converted my Voyager character into the Genshin Tactics system, which was already converted from my original, you know, how it goes. But I've taken her and sort of run through like what sort of questions you have to ask for the character, what sort of specialties do you give them, the attacks, the abilities, the example page of what that might look like. And of course, I do have a quick and dirty character sheet that you can use, and it's in Google Docs. Basically, it's not PDF, fillable PDF yet, but I think for the purposes of playtesting, it should be fine, hopefully. But yeah, that should cover most of it, and it's still in progress, but quite close to completion. And it's a thing I've just been doing like for fun. So if this sort of thing interests you, or you have like a game group that is interested in trying it out, again, check the description for the Voyager server, which is where I'm mostly doing this, and we can probably get a few games arranged, and probably if there's enough support for it, I can make a Ruby conversion for this as well, which, you know, I think I'm gonna do anyway, because, you know, it's just something that I really like doing as a hobby. So it's a system that I quite enjoy, but have not had any really opportunity to play it or have people play it. There is a person on the server, Letters and Punctuation, who is helping to run a campaign, a Ruby style campaign using the Voyager system, which is why I also plan on doing the Ruby conversion sooner or later. But that's all for me, and if you've watched this far already, then thank you for watching, whether you're like a channel regular, or you're watching this because you're a Genshin fan, or you're just a fan of like tabletop design in general. Thanks for watching, because you know, I'm clearly a fan of all of those things. So if you share those interests, then come hit the server. I'm always there, and you can see what we can do. That's all for me, and thanks. We'll see you later.